HOA dumped hundreds of tons of rock to block an ugly road. It was the only way fire trucks could reach home. At 2:13 in the morning, the mountain community of Red Hollow woke to the roar of engines climbing the ridge. A wildfire was racing downhill through dry brush, and 3 fire trucks were fighting to reach the homes below before the flames beat them there. Then the drivers stopped, one after another, their headlights washing over something that should not have been there. Across the only access road stood hundreds of tons of freshly dumped rock, piled higher than a man could climb without slipping. At the top of that pile stood Marlene Voss, president of the Homeowners Association, arms crossed beneath the flashing emergency lights, her silk robe catching the wind like a flag of surrender that refused to be raised. "That road is an eyesore," she said, "and nobody is driving through my community again." One firefighter stepped forward, pointed toward the orange glow swelling over the tree line, and said the words that would follow her for the rest of her life. "Ma'am, you just blocked the only road wide enough for our trucks." Red Hollow at dawn looked like a postcard someone had paid a great deal of money to stage. The houses were expensive and new, their cedar fences stained a uniform honey brown, their hedges clipped into shapes so exact they seemed drawn with a ruler rather than grown from soil. Sprinklers hissed in perfect arcs over lawns that had no business staying green on a mountainside in late summer. Every mailbox matched, every porch light matched. It was the kind of neighborhood built to photograph well, and nearly everyone who lived there understood, without ever being told outright, that appearances were the real currency of the place. But cutting through the center of all that polish ran a road that refused to cooperate with the picture. Ridge Service Road was not paved. In the wet months it turned to soft brown mud that swallowed tires up to the hubcap, and in the dry months it threw up clouds of pale dust that settled on windshields and porch railings alike. It was wider than any of the interior streets, wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass without folding in their mirrors. And it ran in a long, unbroken line from the top of Red Hollow down to the county highway below. Nobody had ever loved that road. Everybody who mattered to the neighborhood's image found it embarrassing. A scar of raw earth running through an otherwise flawless composition, and for years the Homeowners Association had treated it the way a family treats an uncle they are ashamed of, tolerated at holidays, and never mentioned in photographs. Calder Wynn drove his old pickup truck along that road most mornings, because it was the fastest way from his property at the far end of Red Hollow down to the highway. He was 42 years old, a former construction engineer who had spent 2 decades building things other people lived inside of. And somewhere in those 2 decades, he had learned to say less and notice more. He owned a stretch of land that bordered the road, and buried somewhere in a filing cabinet in his garage were survey documents that described exactly what that road was built to be. That morning he slowed his truck near a small hand-painted sign that read, "Red Hollow HOA, Private Community," and found Marlene Voss standing beside it as though she had been waiting for him. She did not greet him. She looked past him at the road itself, the way a woman looks at a stain she has decided she can no longer live with. "You still use it," she said, less a question than an accusation. And Calder answered simply that it was a service road, that it existed for a reason beyond convenience. He had bought his land at the far end of Red Hollow long before the association existed in anything close to its current form, back when the mountainside was still mostly scrub oak, and the few houses scattered across it belonged to families who cared more about water pressure than curb appeal. He had watched the neighborhood change slowly, and then all at once, watched fences go up in matching stain, watched a design committee form, and begin issuing citations for mailboxes that failed to meet an approved template. He kept mostly to himself these days, not out of unfriendliness, but out of a quiet exhaustion with meetings that spent 40 minutes debating the acceptable shade of a garage door. Marlene had arrived only 6 years earlier, yet she moved through Red Hollow as though she had personally willed every hedge and fence post into existence. And in a sense, through sheer force of committee votes, she nearly had. Marlene's mouth tightened into the particular smile she used when she believed she already held the winning hand. "It is the ugliest thing in this entire community," she told him, and something in the way she said entire suggested she had already begun measuring the road against everything else she controlled and finding it unworthy of survival. Calder asked her, carefully, what exactly the association intended to do about it. Marlene told him the board had approved what she called a landscaping improvement, a phrase she delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who had rehearsed it in a mirror. When he pressed her, asking what kind of improvement required weeks of planning and board approval for a stretch of dirt nobody claimed to love, she only smiled wider and told him he would find out soon enough. There was something in her tone that made the hair on his arms rise, though he could not yet say why, and he watched her walk back toward her house with the unhurried step of a woman who believed the outcome was already decided. It was only as he pulled his truck forward that he saw them, a line of flatbed trucks climbing the private drive toward Red Hollow. Each one stacked high with broken gray rock, and something cold settled into his stomach that had nothing to do with the morning chill. By the following morning, the sound of engines had become a constant, rolling presence over Red Hollow, a low, mechanical growl that vibrated through kitchen windows and rattled the good china in a dozen matching cabinets. The flatbed trucks came in a steady procession, one after another, each groaning under a load of broken gray rock that had clearly been quarried somewhere far outside the county. They backed up to the mouth of Ridge Service Road and tipped their beds, and the stone came down in avalanches that sent dust rolling across the nearby lawns, like smoke from a fire nobody had lit. One truckload became two became 10. By mid-morning the count had climbed past a dozen, and still they kept arriving, until the graceful curve of the old road had begun to disappear beneath what looked less like a landscaping project and more like the beginning of a wall. Calder stood at a distance and watched the road he had driven for years vanish stone by stone. The pile grew fast, faster than seemed reasonable for a simple aesthetic fix, rising in jagged gray tiers that caught the morning light and threw sharp shadows across the dirt. Marlene stood near the base of it beside a heavyset man in a reflective vest, gesturing with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed on the first try. "Keep it coming," she told him, and pointed toward a gap near the edge of the pile, where a strip of bare dirt still showed through. The contractor, a man named Silas Mercer, who had spent 30 years moving earth and stone for a living, hesitated with his hand on the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Are you certain you want it fully blocked?" he asked her. And Marlene answered without a flicker of doubt that she had already paid for exactly that. Silas had taken plenty of strange jobs over 30 years in the business, but something about this one had nagged at him since the first morning, a persistent itch he could not quite scratch loose. Marlene had paid in full up front, in cash routed through a shell account rather than the association's usual channels, and she had insisted on a completion timeline, so tight it left no room for the ordinary permitting process he normally handled himself as a courtesy to his clients. He told himself it was not his job to question a paying customer's taste, that plenty of wealthy people made strange decisions about their own property. And he kept his equipment moving, because that was, in the end, what she was paying him to do. That was when Calder finally closed the distance between them. He kept his voice level, the way he had learned to during 2 decades of standing on job sites where panic solved nothing, and told her plainly that the road she was burying fell inside the designated emergency access corridor for the entire mountainside. Marlene laughed, a short, bright sound with no warmth in it, and told him he always did enjoy making everything sound like the end of the world. He pointed down the slope toward the small fire station where 2 trucks sat gleaming in their bays, visible even from where they stood, and reminded her that those trucks were built too wide for the narrow residential loop on the north side of the community. She only shrugged, told him the crews could simply use another way in, and when he told her flatly that there was no other way in, she turned her face toward the mountain and said the sentence that would later be read aloud in a county hearing room. Then perhaps, she said, they should build themselves a prettier road. Behind her, the trucks kept coming, the stone kept falling, and the wall kept climbing higher against the pale morning sky. Silas watched Calder's face for a long moment, as though weighing something he did not yet have words for, then turned back to the trucks and waved the next one forward, because a paycheck was a paycheck, and the woman signing it had made her wishes unmistakably clear. Calder did not wait to watch the rest. He walked back to his truck, pulled his phone from his pocket, and dialed a number he had not used in years, his eyes still fixed on the growing gray mountains swallowing the only road wide enough to save the community it surrounded. "Check the old road files," he said the moment the call connected, his voice tight and low. "I think she just made a mistake big enough to bury this whole neighborhood." The county planning office sat at the end of a low brick building that smelled of old coffee and older paper. And it was there that Calder found Briar Keene bent over a wide table covered in surveyor's maps. She was 39 years old, a county inspector who had built her reputation on refusing to sign anything she had not personally verified, and when Calder laid the photographs of the rock pile on her desk, she went very still. She traced her finger along a red dashed line that ran the length of Ridge Service Road on an older map beneath the current one, and told him quietly that this was not simply a private road, the way the association liked to claim. He asked her outright whether the homeowners association had any legal standing to close it. She was silent for a long moment, before answering that they did not. Not if the road carried the classification, stamped clearly across the old survey in front of her, the words "Emergency Access Route" printed in official block letters that had not faded with the decades. Calder pushed the photographs closer, and Briar's frown deepened as she studied the scale of the blockage. She asked who had authorized the work, and when Calder told her nobody had, not officially, she pulled up the county's permit database on her computer and searched every filing associated with Red Hollow going back 2 years. She checked road maintenance requests, landscaping variances, even the association's own annual reports filed with the county recorder, widening her search further and further, in the growing certainty that she had simply overlooked something. There was nothing. No application. No engineering review. No public notice posted, as county law required, before any modification to a designated corridor. Briar picked up her desk phone without another word and dialed the number listed for the Homeowners Association, and Marlene answered on the second ring with the breezy confidence of a woman who had never once been told no and meant it. "The association is completing a landscaping improvement," Marlene said when Briar identified herself, and Briar replied evenly that landscaping improvements did not typically involve burying an emergency corridor beneath several hundred tons of stone. Marlene's tone sharpened, the warmth draining out of it in an instant, and she told Briar that she disagreed with that particular interpretation of the road's purpose. Briar answered that agreement was not actually required, that the classification existed independent of anyone's opinion of it, and that the association needed to halt all further deliveries immediately pending a formal review. There was a pause on the line. Then the flat click of a call ending without a goodbye. And Briar set the receiver down slowly, while Calder watched her face for some sign of what came next. Calder allowed himself to believe, for perhaps an hour, that the matter would resolve itself quietly through the ordinary channels of county bureaucracy. That hope did not survive the afternoon. By the time he drove back up the mountain, the line of flatbed trucks had returned, longer this time, and the volume of stone tumbling down onto the road had roughly doubled from what he had watched that morning. The wall was no longer a wall in progress. It was becoming a fact on the ground, dense and immovable. And as Calder stood watching it grow, an older woman in a wide straw hat crossed the road to stand beside him, her eyes fixed on the rising stone, with an expression that mixed grief and recognition in equal measure. "You do not understand," Delacroix told him quietly, her voice carrying none of Marlene's polish and all of a lifetime spent in these hills. "Marlene is not blocking that road just because she thinks it is ugly." Della led Calder to the shade of an old oak tree at the edge of her property, the one tree in Red Hollow the association had never managed to have removed, and told him a story that stretched back more than 20 years. Ridge Service Road had not begun as an eyesore at all, she explained. It had been carved into the mountainside in the aftermath of a wildfire that nearly erased 3 neighboring communities from the map, a fire that taught the county a hard lesson about what happened when a mountain full of homes had only one narrow way in and out. The road had been engineered from the start to let fire trucks climb the grade, to let ambulances reach residents having heart attacks at 3 in the morning, to let the entire community evacuate in an orderly line, if the day ever came when evacuation was the only option left. For years, Della said, Marlene had tried in one form or another to have that road erased from Red Hollow's identity, always through smaller and quieter means. A proposal here, a landscaping committee vote there, each attempt failing against the same wall of county regulation that Briar had just cited over the phone. Calder asked her the obvious question. the one that had been building in his chest since that morning. Why this attempt felt different. Why Marlene had suddenly found the nerve to move hundreds of tons of stone without so much as a permit application. Della's answer came without hesitation. Because, she said, there is a development deal now, a large one, and a company with deep pockets wants the parcel of land that sits directly behind Ridge Service Road. Della had lived through the fire that first justified the road's existence, back when she was still a young woman raising 2 children on a property with no association at all, watching over her choice of fence paint. She remembered the smoke turning the noon sky the color of a bruise, remembered county trucks grinding up a rutted logging track because nothing better existed yet, remembered praying that the narrow track would hold long enough for everyone to get out alive. It had, barely, and in the aftermath, the county had commissioned a proper road, wide and solid, precisely so that no family on that mountain would ever again have to gamble their lives on a track built for logging trucks rather than rescue. She had watched that promise slowly become an inconvenience to people who had never once needed it, and it had broken something quiet in her to watch Marlene treat a lesson written in ash as nothing more than a landscaping mistake. If the road were reclassified, Della explained, or simply erased from practical use, the value of certain lots bordering it would shift substantially. And Marlene, it turned out, held a private financial interest in exactly the outcome that shift would produce. Calder felt something cold settle into place behind his ribs, the sensation of a puzzle piece sliding home, even though the picture it revealed was uglier than he had expected. Marlene was not simply defending the appearance of her community. She was defending a payday, dressed up in the language of curb appeal and community pride. And every ounce of her confidence over the past 2 days suddenly made a different kind of sense. Meanwhile, down at the base of the growing stone pile, Silas Mercer had begun doing his own arithmetic, and the numbers troubled him. The tonnage crossing his invoices had already climbed well past what his original contract with the association specified. And when he raised the discrepancy with Marlene directly, she simply handed him an envelope of additional cash and told him to keep working. He asked her plainly what exactly she was trying to bury under all that rock, and for the first time since he had met her, Marlene's composure slipped just enough to show something sharper underneath. That, she told him, was not his concern. He pocketed the envelope because the mortgage on his own equipment did not care about his conscience, but he did not stop watching her after that, and later that evening, standing on a rise above his own property, Calder looked out toward the western ridge and saw a thin column of dark smoke rising against the fading light. The wind picked up after sunset, the way it always did on that mountain once the heat of the day began to bleed away into the darkening sky, and the air had gone bone dry after a summer with almost no rain to speak of. Somewhere in the brush along the western slope, a spark caught, small and unremarkable at first, the kind of thing that under different conditions might have smoldered itself out before anyone noticed. It did not smolder out. Within minutes it had found dry grass, then a stand of brittle scrub oak, and within the hour it had become a fire moving with a speed that made the trained eyes watching it from the valley below go pale. Ronan Vale, 47 years old and captain of the local fire crew, was still awake when the call came through. And he was already pulling on his boots before the dispatcher finished the first sentence. He had spent nearly 25 years fighting fires on that mountain, long enough to have watched 3 separate wildfires come close enough to threaten Red Hollow before this one, and long enough to have developed a deep and unshakable respect for the small handful of access roads that made the difference between a contained fire and a catastrophe. He did not know Marlene Voss personally, had never had reason to attend a homeowners association meeting in his life, but he knew every road on that mountain the way other men knew the streets of their own childhood neighborhoods, and something about the silence on the radio when his crew first approached Red Hollow that night told him this call was going to be different from the others. He gathered his crew with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this more times than he cared to count, and within minutes 3 trucks were rolling out of the station toward Red Hollow, their engines straining against the grade as they climbed. Calder heard the sirens from his porch long before he saw the lights, a sound that carried strangely across the dry canyon air. And when he stepped outside and looked down into the valley, he could see the fire itself now, an orange smear spreading faster than seemed possible along the tree line. Ronan's lead truck reached the mouth of Ridge Service Road first. and the driver hit the brakes hard enough to send gravel skittering across the dirt. Ahead of them, where a clear road should have run straight down toward the highway, there was nothing but a wall of broken gray stone, rising higher than the truck's own cab. Ronan climbed down from the cab and stood in front of it for a long moment in silence, the emergency lights washing red and white across the pale rock, before he finally spoke the question that needed no real answer. "What in the world is this?" he said. And it was Calder, jogging up from his own driveway, who gave him the only word that mattered. "HOA," he said, and Ronan was already reaching for his radio to call Marlene directly. She answered almost immediately, as though she had been waiting for the call, and her voice carried none of the urgency that Ronan's did. "You need to clear this rock right now," he told her. And Marlene answered that the road in question was private property belonging to the association. Ronan reminded her, with the forced patience of a man trying not to shout, that people down the mountain were in genuine danger and needed that route open within minutes, not hours. Marlene repeated, almost word for word, what she had told Breyer earlier that day, that she had already made her position clear and that no one would be driving through her community again. Ronan turned to Calder, his jaw tight, and asked whether there was any other way to bring the trucks through. Calder was already unfolding a worn paper map across the hood of the truck, his flashlight beam trembling slightly as he traced the only alternate route with his finger, and the answer he gave was the one word neither of them wanted to hear. "No," he said. And at that exact moment, a distant explosion rolled down the canyon as a propane tank somewhere in the burning brush went up. And the wind shifted hard, sending the entire wall of flame turning directly toward Red Hollow. None of the 3 fire trucks could push through the narrow residential loop on the north side of Red Hollow, exactly as Calder had warned days earlier. One driver attempted it anyway, easing his truck between a row of parked cars and an ornamental fence, only to find the street too tight to complete the turn at the far end, forcing a slow and agonizing reverse Y, end quote, while precious minutes bled away. Ronan stood with his radio pressed to his ear, listening to a dispatcher relay updates from the valley below, and every word made his expression harder. "We need the ridge route," he said into the radio, his voice clipped and urgent, and the response crackled back that it remained completely blocked. Calder walked the length of the rock wall with his flashlight, running his palm along the jagged surface, doing the same mental math he had done 100 times on job sites over the years. This was not something an ordinary loader could clear in minutes. It would take heavy equipment, hours they did not have, and a level of coordination that no one on that mountain currently possessed. Marlene still stood near the base of the pile, arms crossed, and when Ronan turned to face her directly, something in his posture made even her step back half a pace. "Do you understand what you have actually done here?" he asked her, his voice low and even more frightening for its lack of shouting. And she answered that she was protecting this community. "No," Ronan told her. "You have turned this community into a trap." For the first time since Calder had known her, Marlene said nothing at all, her mouth opening and then closing again around words she apparently could not find, though her feet stayed planted exactly where they were, refusing still to give the order that would open the road. Calder had already dialed Breyer's number, and her voice came through breathless, telling him she was on her way up the mountain as fast as her car would carry her. Behind them, the fire had closed the distance considerably, and a haze of smoke had begun rolling low across the rooftops of Red Hollow, stinging eyes and catching in throats up and down the street. Marlene finally turned to look down the slope at the houses below her own, at the neighbors who had trusted her judgment for years. And something like fear flickered across her face for the first time that night. She thought, briefly, of the pending sale, of the careful arithmetic she had done in private for months about what the closed road would mean for the value of the parcel behind it, and some small, stubborn part of her still believed there might be a way to protect both the deal and the community if she simply held her ground a little longer. But even fear was not enough to make her move. And by then it hardly mattered whether she gave permission or not, because nobody on that road was waiting for her permission any longer. Ronan straightened his shoulders, looked once more at the immovable wall of stone, and keyed his radio with a decision that had clearly been building in him for the last several minutes. "Prepare a plan to break through the rock wall," he said. And around him, his crew began moving toward the equipment truck without waiting to be asked twice. Breyer arrived just as the crew was unloading heavy equipment, her headlights cutting through the smoke as she parked at an angle across the shoulder of the road. She moved straight to the pile with a tablet in hand, pulling up every filing associated with the property in the county system, and confirmed within seconds what she had already suspected earlier that day. There was no permit. There was no closure order. There was no safety assessment on file anywhere, nothing that would have given the association legal cover for what stood in front of them. She turned to Marlene, who had not moved from her position near the base of the stone, and told her flatly that she had unilaterally blocked a designated emergency access route without a single shred of authorization. Marlene tried, in that moment, to shift the weight of what had happened onto someone else, insisting that the contractor was the one responsible for the decision. Silas, who had driven back up the mountain the moment he heard about the fire, stepped forward immediately and refused to let the accusation stand. "No," he said. "You signed the contract," and he pulled out his phone to prove it, paging through message threads that documented every instruction Marlene had given him over the preceding days. Text, messages, invoices, delivery schedules, a running record of exactly how much stone she had demanded and exactly when she had demanded it delivered, all of it stamped with dates and timestamps that left no room for interpretation. Breyer Cross referenced the timestamps against the county's delivery logs as she went, matching each message to a corresponding load of stone, building a timeline so complete it left no room for anyone to later claim confusion or misunderstanding. She noted the pattern of payments routed outside the association's standard vendor account. The absence of any board meeting minutes authorizing an expenditure of that size, and the way every instruction in the thread had come directly from Marlene's personal number, rather than through any official association channel. It was, she would later tell a colleague, one of the cleanest paper trails she had ever seen in a case like this. Ironic given how badly its author had wanted everything about the project to remain hidden. Breyer studied each message in silence, her expression darkening with every passing line, until she reached one final document buried near the bottom of Silas's saved files. A private land purchase agreement Marlene had apparently forwarded to him by mistake weeks earlier. It named a development company, a parcel of land directly behind Ridge Service Road, and a financial stake belonging to Marlene Voss that would only pay out if the road's classification changed. Calder read it over Breyer's shoulder and felt the last piece of the puzzle lock into place with a quiet, bitter finality. "So that is the real reason," he said, and Marlene's composure finally cracked all the way through. "You do not understand any of this," she snapped at him, her voice rising for the first time that night. And Calder answered simply that he understood it completely. He pulled a folded paper from inside his jacket, an older engineering document he had kept in his own files for years, and laid it flat against the hood of Breyer's car. Ridge Service Road was never simply a private road belonging to the association, he told her. It had been protected under county planning designation since the year it was built, precisely because a wildfire decades earlier had shown exactly what happened to a mountain community, with only one narrow way out. No association, however wealthy or however certain of its own taste, held the authority to erase a road like that from existence. Breyer's radio crackled to life at that exact moment, an urgent voice cutting through the static to report that the fire had jumped the western containment line entirely. Ronan did not wait for another exchange of accusations. He gave the order to bring the heavy equipment forward, and within minutes the machines were rumbling toward the base of the stone wall, their headlights carving pale cones through the drifting smoke. Silas hesitated only briefly before climbing into the cab of the loader himself, his years of experience taking over where his earlier reluctance had stood. Calder walked alongside the machine, pointing toward a section near the left edge of the pile where the stones sat less densely packed, and told Silas to begin breaking through there, where the structure would give way fastest. The loader's bucket bit into the base of the pile, and the first section of stone gave way with a grinding roar that echoed off the surrounding hillside. A second section followed almost immediately, sliding loose in a cascade of gray rubble that sent dust billowing up into the beams of the emergency lights. Marlene screamed at them to stop, insisting they had no right to touch what she still considered her property, and Ronan turned to face her one final time, with a look that ended the argument before it could properly begin. "You no longer have any say in this decision," he told her, and then he turned his back on her completely, directing his full attention to the machine clearing the road. The loader kept working, tearing through tons of stone in steady, grinding passes, pushing the broken rock aside in growing mounds along the shoulders of the road. Minutes stretched into what felt like far longer than they were. Each one measured against the advancing wall of orange light climbing the ridge behind them, until at last a gap wide enough for a fire truck opened through the center of the pile. The lead engine eased forward first, its tires crunching over loose gravel, and then it was through, its siren rising again as it picked up speed down the newly cleared grade. Ronan watched it go, and turned to Calder with something close to relief in his voice. "This road just saved the entire community," he said. But Calder did not answer right away, his eyes fixed instead on the fire still climbing the far ridge, aware that the danger was far from finished. It was only moments later that a low rumble rolled down from somewhere above them. A sound distinct from the fire, distinct from the machinery. A sound that made every head on that road turn upward at once. A section of the slope above the road, loosened by days of heavy equipment and hundreds of tons of displaced weight, began sliding downward in a slow, gathering wave of loose earth and stone. Dust and loose gravel poured down across the newly cleared gap in a hissing gray curtain, and for one long moment, nobody could tell whether the entire slope above them intended to follow. Ronan grabbed Marlene by the arm and pulled her bodily away from the base of the slide before she fully understood what was happening, an act of instinct that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with a lifetime spent keeping people alive regardless of what they deserved. Calder shouted for everyone to clear the area, and a second fire truck, halfway through the gap, narrowly avoided being caught in the edge of the slide as it lurched forward out of the danger zone. Standing at the edge of the chaos, Calder finally understood the full and terrible shape of what Marlene's decision had actually done to the mountain beneath their feet. Once the fire had finally been pushed back from Red Hollow in the gray hours before dawn, a different kind of reckoning began, quieter than the flames but no less consequential. County engineers arrived within days to survey the damage along Ridge Service Road, and their findings, once compiled, painted a picture far worse than anyone standing on that road during the emergency had realized in the moment. The hundreds of tons of stone had done more than simply block a route. They had altered the natural drainage patterns across the entire slope, redirecting runoff in ways the mountainside had never been engineered to handle, adding enormous and uneven weight to ground that had not been assessed for it, and measurably increasing the risk of the very landslide that had nearly caught a fire truck in its path. Marlene was called before a formal county hearing to explain her actions, and she arrived dressed as impeccably as ever, as though the right outfit might still be enough to carry her through. "I only wanted our community to look beautiful," she told the panel, and Breyer, seated at the front of the room with a folder of evidence in front of her, answered that nothing about beauty mattered to a family who could not escape their own street in an emergency. Silas testified next, laying out every text message, every invoice, every instruction Marlene had given him over the course of the project, refusing this time to let any blame settle anywhere but where it belonged. Della followed him, offering the county the full history of the road, the wildfire decades earlier that had led to its construction, and the years of quiet attempts Marlene had made to erase it long before any development deal existed to explain her motives. One board member asked Marlene directly why she had never once brought the road closure to a formal vote of the membership, as the association's own bylaws required for any project of that scale, and she answered only that she had been confident the membership would have supported her judgment regardless. Another asked why the timeline had been pushed so aggressively, faster than any legitimate landscaping project would reasonably require, and she offered no real answer at all, staring instead at a spot on the table in front of her. The room had grown very quiet by the time she finished, the kind of quiet that told her, more clearly than any verdict could, exactly how the hearing was going to end. Calder spoke last, laying his old engineering documents across the table in front of the panel, tracing the road's protected status back to its origin and connecting each fact to the next until the entire picture stood complete and undeniable. The Homeowners Association was placed under formal investigation. The pending land development deal, the one that had quietly motivated Marlene's actions from the very beginning, was suspended indefinitely pending review. Every dollar required to clear the remaining stone and restore the road to a safe and passable condition was assigned as a direct financial responsibility to those who had ordered the work without authorization in the first place, and Marlene's name sat at the top of that list. She lost her position as president of the association within the month, voted out by a board that no longer had any interest in defending her judgment. Before she left the final meeting, she found Calder waiting near the door and could not resist one last accusation, telling him that he had destroyed everything she had built. He did not raise his voice or reach for anything close to triumph. "No," he told her simply. And then he nodded toward the mountain rising beyond the window behind her. "You destroyed it yourself," he said. "The moment you decided that how something looked mattered more than whether it kept people alive." It was only later that week, while reviewing the county's older archived files for an unrelated reason, that Calder found his own name buried in a set of engineering signatures from many years earlier, and realized with quiet astonishment that he had been one of the original engineers who helped design the very road he had just spent days fighting to save. He sat with that discovery for a long time, turning the old blueprint over in his hands, tracing the careful grade calculations he had made as a much younger man, who had never imagined he would one day live at the far end of the very road he was drafting. There was something almost unbearably fitting about it, a circle closing after 2 decades, as though some quieter part of him had known all along exactly what that stretch of dirt was worth, long before Marlene Voss ever decided it was worth nothing at all. Several weeks passed before Ridge Service Road was fully restored, graded smooth again beneath the same relentless mountain sun that had once made it look so dusty and unworthy of the community around it. Nobody called it the ugly road anymore, not even in passing. Not even the residents who had once complained loudest about how it lowered the tone of their carefully curated street. A new sign was installed at its entrance, larger and sturdier than the small hand-painted one Marlene had once stood beside, reading "Emergency Access Route, keep clear at all times." The rest of the association's board, chastened by weeks of hearings and headlines neither the community nor the county could ignore, quietly revised the bylaws to require a full membership vote before any future project could alter the classification or condition of a protected road. A handful of residents who had once complained loudest about the road's appearance found themselves oddly silent on the subject now, unwilling to be seen defending the very aesthetic argument that had nearly gotten their neighbors killed. Ronan brought his crew back one final time to walk the length of the road, checking sightlines and turning radii with the same careful attention they gave every route in the county, and pronouncing it, at last, exactly as safe as it had always been designed to be. Silas showed up on his own time to help repair sections of the surface that had been chewed up by the loader during the emergency, working without pay for reasons he did not explain to anyone and did not need to. Della stood at her most mornings that week, watching the work continue, occasionally lifting a hand toward Calder as he passed, the two of them sharing an understanding that needed no further words between them. Calder stood at the edge of the road one afternoon, looking out over the full sweep of Red Hollow spread below him, when Briar came to stand beside him with her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. "You know," she said, "if you had not been standing there that first morning, none of this might have come to light in time." Calder shook his head slowly, watching the sunlight move across the ridgeline in the distance. "Ronan is the one who saved them," he said, and from somewhere down the slope, close enough to have overheard, Ronan called back that none of it would have mattered at all if the road itself had not still been sitting there beneath all that stone, waiting to be found again. Marlene no longer held any power over the community she had once ruled with such absolute certainty. She faced the ongoing weight of legal proceedings and financial penalties that would follow her for a long time to come, consequences she had brought entirely upon herself through a decision made in service of vanity rather than safety. There was no dramatic confrontation staged for anyone's satisfaction, no elaborate reversal of fortune designed to humiliate her further than the truth already had. The victory, such as it was, belonged entirely to the fact that the truth had finally been proven, laid out plainly for anyone willing to look at it, undeniable and complete. At the end of that long week, Calder drove the length of Ridge Service Road one more time. Alone, windows down, dust rising behind his tires exactly as it always had. The road was still unpaved. It was still, by any reasonable measure, plain and a little rough around the edges. Nothing anyone would choose to feature in a glossy photograph of the neighborhood. But it was open now, wide from end to end, and it was safe in a way that no amount of expensive landscaping could ever have made it. He stopped his truck near the new sign at the entrance and stepped out just as Ronan pulled up behind him in his own vehicle, the two men standing together for a quiet moment, looking back down over the rooftops of Red Hollow spread beneath them in the late afternoon light. "There are things that look wrong on the surface," Ronan said eventually, breaking the silence between them, "but that exist for a reason worth protecting." Calder allowed himself something close to a smile as he considered the road stretching out below them, plain and dusty and utterly indispensable. "And sometimes," he answered, "the ugliest thing in the whole neighborhood turns out to be the only thing standing between everyone and disaster." The camera of memory, if such a thing could be said to exist, seemed to pull back slowly from that final image. The dirt road tracing its long, unhurried line down through the mountainside, Red Hollow spread out beneath it in the fading afternoon light. There was no wall of stone across it any longer. There was no towering pile blocking the way. No monument to vanity dressed up as improvement. There was only a simple road, worn and imperfect and entirely necessary. A road that from that day forward, nobody in Red Hollow would ever again dare call useless. Do not measure the worth of a thing by how it appears on the surface. A road can be plain. A person can seem unremarkable. A piece of property can look far from impressive standing beside its polished neighbors, but the true value of any of them rarely reveals itself until everything else has fallen apart. And it is only then, in the wreckage of what once seemed so certain, that people finally recognize the very thing they dismissed as the one thing they needed most all along.